The morning she left, Sarah forgot to take her wedding ring off. Not because she wanted to keep it, not because she had forgotten what it meant, but because after 25 years of wearing something every single day, your finger forgets what it feels like to be bare. The skin remembers a weight that isn't there anymore. You reach for things with a hand that doesn't quite belong to you. She discovered this at the first stoplight outside Napa Valley when she looked down at the steering wheel of her beat-up 1998 Ford Ranger, the truck her grandfather had bought new, the truck her ex-husband had called an embarrassment for 15 years, and saw the platinum band still sitting there, catching the early morning light like a small, cruel joke. The truck had been sitting in the back of the equipment shed for 8 years, covered in dust and spiderwebs and the kind of neglect that comes from being deemed worthless by people who measure everything in dollars. The tires were flat, the battery was dead. The interior smelled like mice and old hay and the particular sadness of things left behind. But it started. That was the thing her ex-husband had never understood about old things. They survived, not because they were strong or valuable or impressive. They survived because they were built by people who believed in keeping things alive, who understood that worth and price were two different languages, who knew that a thing didn't have to be beautiful to deserve care. The truck coughed to life at 5:47 on a Tuesday morning, and Sarah backed it out of the shed just as the first light began to touch the grapevines she had planted with her own hands, one cutting at a time, in soil she had tested and amended and prayed over for 2.5 decades. She didn't look back. That's what she would tell people later when they asked. I didn't look back. But the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that she couldn't look back, because if she had, she wouldn't have been able to leave. Not because of love, that had died somewhere around year 18, suffocated by silence and resentment and the slow, grinding erosion of being treated like an employee in her own life, but because of the grapes, because of the soil she knew better than her own body, because of the cellar where she had spent thousands of nights alone with barrels and bottles and the quiet company of chemistry and patience and hope. She had built that winery. Not him. Not really. He had provided the money, yes, his family's money, old money, the kind that came with expectations and obligations and a certain kind of cold, polished cruelty that never raised its voice. But she had provided everything else. The knowledge, the taste, the relationships with growers, the understanding of fermentation that bordered on the spiritual, the ability to stand in a dark cellar at 2 a.m. and know, by smell alone, whether a batch was turning properly. She had given 25 years of her life to a man who, in the end, thanked her by having his lawyer deliver divorce papers on a Thursday afternoon, followed by a restraining order that same evening, not because she had ever threatened him, but because his new girlfriend, a woman 20 years younger who wore designer boots to a vineyard and called herself a wine entrepreneur, had said she felt unsafe. The judge had believed them. Sarah had sat in the courtroom and listened to a man she had slept next to for most of her adult life describe her as unstable, as volatile, as a woman who might do something dangerous if provoked. She had watched him cry, actually cry, while talking about how difficult the marriage had been, how he had tried everything, how he was genuinely afraid for his safety and the safety of his new partner. She had said nothing, not because she was dignified, not because she was strong, but because she was so deeply, profoundly shocked that she couldn't find her voice. She sat there with her hands folded in her lap, wearing the only dress she owned that still fit properly, and listened to a stranger describe a life she didn't recognize. The judge awarded him the winery, the house, the accounts, the reputation, everything she had built, everything she had bled for, everything she had sacrificed children and friendships and her own physical health to create, all of it transferred in the space of 45 minutes to a man who had never once stayed up all night during harvest, who had never pulled a tick off his own neck after a day in the high vineyard blocks, who had never cried over a barrel of spoiled wine like it was a dying child. She got the truck. She got the cider mill. She got her grandfather's old tools and the 40 acres of mountain land no one had visited in 30 years. Her lawyer had called it a fair settlement. Sarah had looked at the document, at the line where her signature was supposed to go, and thought about her grandfather. About the way he had smelled like apples and wood smoke and something else, something she had never been able to name. something that might have been patience, or might have been wisdom, or might have been the simple scent of a man who had learned, through decades of quiet failure, how to keep going when everything told him to stop. She signed. The truck's engine sputtered twice on the drive east, climbing into the foothills where the air changed from the dry heat of the valley to the cooler, sharper scent of pines and cedars and the promise of elevation. Each time, she held her breath, waiting for the final cough, the death rattle, the moment when the old machine would give up and leave her stranded on a 2-lane road with nothing but her suitcase and a cardboard box of photographs and a wedding ring she hadn't managed to remove. But the truck kept going, like it remembered something she had forgotten, like it knew something she was only beginning to learn. The road narrowed as she climbed higher. Pavement gave way to gravel, gravel gave way to dirt. Dirt gave way to 2 tire tracks through grass that hadn't been cut in years, and then to nothing at all. Just a hillside of briars and blackberries, and young trees that had grown up through what used to be a driveway. She parked at the bottom of the hill because the truck couldn't go any further, and because she needed a moment before she saw it. The cider mill. Her grandfather's cider mill. The place she had visited as a child, when the world was simple and her hands were small, and the smell of pressed apples meant safety and love, and the particular magic of watching something transform. She had stood on this hillside at 7 years old, wearing a yellow raincoat that was too big for her, watching her grandfather turn windfall apples into something golden and alive, and she had thought, with the absolute certainty of childhood, that this was what she would do forever. Then she had grown up. Then she had gone to college. Then she had met a man with money and ambition and a vision for a winery that would put Napa on the map, and she had convinced herself that grapes were close enough to apples, that soil was soil, that the magic of fermentation would translate. It had. She had been right about that. She had made extraordinary wine, wine that won awards, wine that critics called visionary and transcendent, and a new voice in California winemaking. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten the taste of wild apples. The truck door groaned when she opened it, a sound like something waking up after a long sleep, stiff and confused and uncertain about what year it was. She stepped out onto grass that came up to her knees, and for a moment she just stood there, breathing. The air was different up here, not just cooler but older, heavier with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves and the particular green smell of things growing without permission. It smelled like her grandfather's hands. It smelled like her own hands before she had started wearing gloves in the cellar, before she had started caring about manicures and appearances and the judgment of people who had never pressed an apple in their lives. She walked up the hill through grass that soaked her boots and briars, that caught at her jeans, and the constant, insistent hum of insects that didn't care about her divorce or her legal fees or the quiet devastation she was carrying in her chest. The mill came into view slowly, like something emerging from fog. Gray wood. That was her first thought. So much gray wood. The building had been painted once, red, she remembered, a deep, cheerful red that her grandfather had insisted on because apples deserved to come from something happy. But the paint had long since peeled away, leaving behind a skeleton of weathered boards that seemed to blend into the hillside itself. The roof had collapsed in 2 places. The windows were gone, just empty holes now, like eyes that had forgotten how to see. The door hung at an angle, held by a single hinge that had somehow outlasted its companions, creaking slightly in a breeze that didn't seem to be moving anything else. And all around it, climbing up the walls and through the broken windows and over the collapsed roof, were blackberries. Vines thick as her wrist, woven together into something that looked less like plants and more like an attempt by the earth itself to reclaim what had been taken from it. This was what her lawyer had called fair. This rotting building on a forgotten hillside, 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible by a road that wasn't really a road, surrounded by trees that had grown wild and fruit that had fallen and rotted and seeded itself for 3 decades. This was what she had left. Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, 50 feet from the mill, and felt something move in her chest. Not hope. She was too tired for hope, Not despair. She had already done her despair, had spent 6 months crying in a rented room above a garage, had learned that there was a limit to how many tears a body could produce before it simply stopped trying. It was something else, something quieter, something that felt almost like recognition. She had been here before, not just as a child, but in a deeper sense. She had stood at the edge of impossible things before, had looked at barren soil and thought there is nothing here. And then she had put her hands in the dirt anyway, because what else was there to do? She walked toward the door. The blackberries resisted. They always did. That was their nature. To hold onto things, to protect what they had claimed, to make you work for every inch of ground. She pushed through them, feeling the thorns catch at her sleeves, her hair, the soft skin of her wrists. Small lines of blood appeared, bright against her pale skin, and she didn't wipe them away. The door gave way when she touched it, not because she pushed hard, she barely touched it at all, but the remaining hinge had been waiting, maybe for years, for permission to finally let go. The door fell inward with a sound, like something sighing, and dust rose up to meet her, ancient and thick and smelling of rot and time, and something else beneath it all, something sweet and faintly alcoholic that made her stop breathing for a moment. She knew that smell. She had been smelling it for 30 years, in cellars and fermentation rooms, and the quiet dark spaces where wine became what it was supposed to be. But this was different. This was older, wilder, less controlled. This was the smell of apples that had fermented without human intervention, that had followed their own instincts, that had turned themselves into something new without asking permission. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness inside. The mill was smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing. As a child, it had seemed enormous, a cathedral of apples, a palace of pressing and grinding and the mechanical magic of extraction. But now, standing in the doorway, she could see that it was just a building. One room, really, with a loft above that had probably been for storage, and a floor that sloped downward toward the back wall where the press itself still stood. The press. She had forgotten how big it was. The photographs hadn't captured it. The memories hadn't either, not really. Because the press wasn't just a machine, it was a monument, a massive structure of oak and iron, built by hand in the 1880s by someone who had understood that apples deserved respect, that the act of pressing them was not extraction, but collaboration, that the weight of the screw had to be balanced against the fragility of the fruit. The wooden beams were 4 feet thick, stained dark by a century of juice and time. The iron screw rose up through the center, rusted now, but still straight, still true, still waiting for someone to turn it. The pressing basket, a cage of oak staves bound by iron hoops, had collapsed in on itself. The wood split and separated, but the pieces were all there, lying on the stone floor like the bones of something that had once been alive. Sarah walked toward it, her boots echoing on the stone floor, and dust rose around her feet like smoke. The pressing stones were still in place. She hadn't expected that. She had expected them to be gone, stolen, maybe, or rolled away, or simply forgotten in some corner where they had been left to die. But there they were, 2 massive granite wheels, each one easily 6 feet in diameter, lying flat on the circular track where they had been rolled for 100 years by horses or mules, or, in her grandfather's time, by the careful labor of human hands. She knelt beside the nearest stone and ran her palm across its surface, smooth, so smooth. Smoother than glass, smoother than anything that had been carved by human hands had any right to be. Generations of apples had done this. The acid in the juice, the pressure of the stone against the track, the slow, grinding motion of 100,000 rotations. The stone had been polished not by tools but by work, by the patient accumulation of effort, by the simple fact of doing the same thing over and over for longer than anyone could remember. Her hand stopped. There was something carved into the stone. Not deep. Just a scratch, really the kind of thing you might not notice if you weren't looking for it. But she was looking. She was always looking, had been trained by decades in the cellar to notice the small things, the details that other people missed. She leaned closer, letters, initials maybe. Worn down by time and juice and the endless grinding of apple bussets, but still visible if you caught the light at the right angle. SM, and beneath it a date, 1947. Sarah's breath caught. Her grandfather's name had been Samuel. Samuel Morgan. And 1947 was the year he had bought the mill, the year he had walked away from a job at a cannery and a steady paycheck and every definition of security that had ever been written, because he had tasted cider once. Real cider, wild cider, the kind that couldn't be bought or sold, and had decided that this was what he wanted to do with his hands. She had heard the story 100 times. Her mother had told it, usually with a sigh, usually with the kind of affectionate exasperation reserved for people who made impractical choices. Your grandfather and his apples, her mother would say, shaking her head. He could have done anything. He chose this. But Sarah had never understood the story until now, kneeling in the dust of a collapsed building, with her hand on a stone that had been carved by a man she had loved more than almost anyone in her life. months, long before anyone had thought to write down what varieties existed in this valley. Sarah walked toward the tree slowly, like approaching something sacred, and reached up to touch the nearest apple. It came off the branch easily, almost eagerly, as if it had been waiting for her. She held it in her palm, feeling its weight, its coolness, the slight give of the skin when she pressed her thumb against it. She bit into it. The flavor hit her like a memory she didn't know she had, sharp and sweet and tannic all at once, with an undertone of something floral, something honeyed, something that tasted like the forest floor after rain and the first warm day of spring, and every good thing she had ever forgotten. She closed her eyes and chewed slowly, letting the juice run down her chin. And she thought about her grandfather standing in this same clearing, tasting this same apple, understanding something that she was only beginning to understand. This was what he had been trying to preserve. Not the mill, not the press, not even the yeast, really. This tree. These apples. This particular combination of soil and water and microclimate and time that produced fruit that couldn't be replicated anywhere else in the world. She finished the apple and threw the core into the woods, where it would rot and seed itself and produce more trees, more apples, more of whatever magic had been growing here for longer than anyone could remember. Then she started looking for more. The apple trees were everywhere. That was the thing she hadn't expected. She had assumed there would be a few, the remnants of an old orchard maybe, planted by the original homesteaders and then forgotten. But what she found over the next 2 weeks of walking the property was something else entirely. Dozens of trees, maybe hundreds. Some were old, ancient really, with trunks as thick as her body and branches that had stopped producing years ago but still stood there, stubborn and patient, waiting for something she couldn't name. Others were young, saplings that had sprung up from fallen fruit, their trunks still green and flexible, their first apples small and bitter but full of potential. And they were all different. Every tree produced fruit that was slightly, or sometimes dramatically, different from its neighbors. Different colors, different shapes, different flavors, different levels of sweetness and astringency and acidity. Some were good for eating, some were clearly meant for cooking, and some were perfect for cider. She knew this without tasting, without testing, without any of the instruments she had relied on for 30 years. She knew it from the smell. The good cider apples, the ones her grandfather had called spitters because they were so tannic you wanted to spit them out, had a particular scent when they were ripe. Something sharp, something almost medicinal, something that made her mouth water in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. She found 12 trees like that in the first week alone, and she found something else, something she hadn't been looking for. Something that had been sitting in plain sight for 30 years, waiting for someone to notice. The well. It was at the bottom of the hill, maybe 200 yards from the mill, tucked into a small depression that had filled with ferns and moss and the particular kind of green that grows only where water is constant. She had walked past it a dozen times without seeing it, because it didn't look like a well. It looked like a hole in the ground, nothing more, covered by a rusted grate that had long since collapsed under the weight of leaves and time. But the sound gave it away. Water. Moving water. The kind of sound you don't notice until you're listening for it, and then you can't stop hearing it. A soft, constant murmur, like the earth itself was whispering something she couldn't quite understand. She cleared the grate away. It came apart in her hands, the metal so thin with rust that it crumbled like paper, and looked down into the darkness below. The water was maybe 20 feet down, visible as a faint shimmer in the shadows. Clear. So clear she could see the rocks at the bottom, the small movements of something alive down there, the way the light played across the surface like it was showing off. She remembered the ledger entry. The granite aquifer is filtering everything, better than any commercial system I've ever seen. She found a piece of string in her pocket. She had started carrying string everywhere, along with pruning shears and a small knife and a dozen other tools she had learned she needed, and tied it to a rock, lowering it down until she heard the splash. Then she pulled it up slowly, carefully, and touched the wet string to her tongue. The water was cold, so cold it made her teeth ache. And it was clean, cleaner than anything that came out of a tap, cleaner than the filtered water she had used at the winery, clean in a way that felt almost impossible for something that had been sitting open to the elements for 30 years. She lowered the string again, this time tying a small jar to the end, one of the jars she had brought from the mill, one of the ones that had been sitting on a shelf for decades, waiting to be used. When she pulled it up, the water inside was so clear it looked like air, like nothing at all, like the jar was empty except for the faintest suggestion of something cold and alive. She drank it, all of it, in one long swallow that made her throat ache and her chest tighten and her eyes water. And when she finished, she sat down on the damp ground beside the well and cried again, because the water tasted like her grandfather's cider, like the cider she had drunk as a child, like the cider she had spent 30 years trying to recreate without ever understanding what she was missing. The water. It had always been the water. She sat there until the light began to fade, until the owls started calling and the bats began to flicker across the darkening sky, until she couldn't see her own hands in front of her face. And then she stood up, brushed the dirt off her jeans, and walked back to the mill in the dark, because she knew the path now, knew every root and rock and turn, knew this land in a way she hadn't known anything in years. The first press happened on a Sunday. She hadn't planned it that way. Sunday was just the day she finished clearing the press, the day she finally cut away the last blackberry vine, the day she swept the last of the dust and debris from the pressing floor and stood back to look at what she had uncovered. The press was damaged, yes. The wooden basket would need to be rebuilt. The staves had split and warped, and at least 3 of them were beyond repair. The iron screw was rusted, but not seized. She had spent 3 days working oil into the threads, turning it a 1/4 inch at a time, feeling it loosen gradually beneath her hands. The stones were still in place, still smooth, still waiting. But the wooden beams that supported the whole structure, the massive oak timbers that had been cut and shaped in the 1880s, were solid. Not just solid, but stronger than they had any right to be. The years had hardened them, compressed them, turned them into something almost like iron. When she knocked on them with her knuckles, they rang like bells. She had 20 gallons of apple juice. Not from the wild trees. Those weren't ready yet. Wouldn't be for another month at least. But there were other trees on the property, younger trees, trees that had been planted by her grandfather or perhaps by the original homesteaders, and they were heavy with fruit that was starting to drop. She had spent the past week gathering windfalls, cutting out the bad spots, grinding the good fruit in the small hand-cranked grinder she had found in the loft. It was slow work, brutal work, the kind of work that reminded you that your body was made of flesh and bone and limited patience. But there was something meditative about it, something almost prayerful. Each apple she cut, each piece she fed into the grinder, each drop of juice that emerged from the press was a small act of defiance against everything that had told her she was done. She was finished. She had nothing left to offer. The yeast was ready. She had fed it for 2 weeks, giving it small amounts of apple juice, watching it bubble and grow and transform. The clay jar had been replaced by a glass carboy, the only one she'd been able to find, tucked away in a corner of the mill's cellar, covered in dust but intact. And the yeast had taken to its new home eagerly, almost hungrily, doubling in volume every day, filling the carboy with a smell that made her dizzy with hope. She poured the juice into the press, not all of it, just 5 gallons, just enough for a test batch, and began to turn the screw. The sound was awful at first, metal scraping against metal, the protest of something that hadn't moved in 30 years, the kind of noise that made you want to cover your ears and walk away. But she kept turning, kept applying pressure, kept ignoring the voice that told her this was stupid, this was pointless, this was the desperate act of a woman who didn't know when to quit. And then the juice began to flow. Not much at first. A trickle, really, dark and cloudy and full of solids that would need to settle out. But it was juice. Real juice. Juice that smelled like apples and earth and the particular magic that happened when you applied pressure to fruit. She let it run into a clean bucket, watching it fill inch by inch, and when the bucket was full, she carried it to the carboy and poured the juice in, slowly, carefully, trying not to disturb the yeast that had settled at the bottom. Then she added the yeast starter. Just a cup of it, bubbling and alive, poured into the carboy like a promise. She watched it sink through the juice, watched the first tiny bubbles rise to the surface, watched the liquid shift from still to moving, from dead to alive. And then she waited. The waiting was the hardest part. She had forgotten that, or maybe she had chosen to forget it, because the waiting was also the most important part, the part where everything could go wrong or right or somewhere in between. Fermentation was a living process, a conversation between yeast and sugar, and time, and you couldn't rush it any more than you could rush a child growing up, or a wound healing, or a heart learning to trust again. She set the carboy in the corner of the mill where the temperature stayed coolest. The granite beneath the floor kept it at a steady 58 degrees, according to the thermometer she had found in the ledger, and she tried to do other things: clear more blackberries, fix the roof, repair the door, make the mill into something that looked less like a ruin and more like a place where work happened. But her eyes kept drifting back to the carboy. She watched the bubbles. She watched the yeast work. She watched the juice change color, slowly, gradually, from cloudy brown to something clearer, something almost golden. And every evening, when the light was too dim to work anymore, she would sit beside the carboy and just watch it, feeling the quiet hum of fermentation through the glass, the tiny vibrations that told her something was happening. Her grandfather had written about this in the ledger. The waiting is where the magic happens. Anyone can press apples. Anyone can add yeast. But the waiting, the watching, the patience, the willingness to let time do its work, that's what separates cider from juice. That's what makes it worth drinking. On the 7th day, she tasted it. Not a full glass, just a sip, drawn from the carboy with a sanitized turkey baster held up to the light, then touched to her tongue. The flavor was young, immature. It tasted like apples and yeast and the faintest hint of something else, something that might become honey or might become vinegar or might become nothing at all. But beneath that, underneath the greenness and the immaturity and the rawness of a fermentation that had only just begun, she could taste something that made her hands shake. Potential. Real potential. The kind of potential she hadn't tasted in years, not since the early days at the winery, when everything was new and nothing was certain and every barrel held the possibility of greatness. She capped the carboy and went back to work. The local market was 40 miles away, in a town called Oak Springs that had been dying slowly for 50 years. Sarah had driven through it twice, on her way to and from the mill, and both times she had been struck by how quiet it was. Not the peaceful quiet of a place at rest, but the hollow quiet of a place that had been forgotten. Empty storefronts, cracked sidewalks, a main street that seemed to lead nowhere in particular, lined with buildings that had clearly once been something: a hotel, a bank, a movie theater, and were now just shells, waiting for someone to either tear them down or remember they existed. But there was a farmer's market on Saturdays. She had seen the sign on her last trip through, hand-painted and faded, nailed to a telephone pole at the edge of town. Oak Springs Farmer's Market, every Saturday, 8 a.m. to 1 p.m., local goods only. She didn't have much to sell: 5 gallons of cider, bottled in a mix of mason jars and recycled wine bottles, and anything else she could find that would hold liquid. No labels, no branding, no fancy packaging. Just a handwritten tag tied to each bottle with twine. Wild Apple Cider. Morgan Family Mill. She loaded the bottles into the truck at 5 a.m. before the sun had even thought about rising, and drove the 40 miles on roads that were dark and empty and lit only by her headlights and the faint glow of the dashboard. The truck ran better than it had a month ago. She had changed the oil, replaced the spark plugs, done the kind of basic maintenance that her ex-husband had always hired someone else to do. It still coughed sometimes, still shuddered on the hills, still smelled faintly of mice and old hay. But it ran. The farmer's market was smaller than she had expected. 8 tables set up in the parking lot of an old hardware store that looked like it hadn't sold hardware in a decade. A few farmers selling vegetables that had seen better days. A woman with homemade jam. A man with honey. And, at the far end of the lot, a table that was clearly meant to be hers. Empty, waiting, covered in dust that had blown in from the street. She set up slowly, carefully, arranging her bottles so they caught the morning light. She had no canopy, no tablecloth, no signage, just the bottles and the twine and a small stack of paper cups for samples. The first hour passed without a single customer. The second hour brought a few browsers, people who walked past her table, glanced at the bottles, and kept walking. She poured samples anyway, small cups of cider that she set out on the table, and watched as people ignored them or, occasionally, picked them up and sniffed them before setting them back down. She was about to pack up when a woman stopped in front of her table. Older, maybe 70, with gray hair pulled back in a loose bun and hands that looked like they had done real work. She picked up one of the bottles, turned it over in her hands, read the tag. "Morgan," she said. "Any relation to Samuel Morgan?" Sarah felt something catch in her chest. "He was my grandfather." The woman nodded slowly, like she had expected that answer. "I remember his cider. My husband used to buy it back in the 70s. Best cider I ever tasted." She paused, looking at the bottle in her hands. "This the same recipe?" "Close," Sarah said. "I found his yeast, his starter culture. It's been dormant for 30 years, but I woke it up." The woman looked at her for a long moment, her eyes sharp and assessing in a way that made Sarah feel like she was being measured. Then she picked up one of the sample cups and took a sip. She didn't say anything, didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't give any indication of what she was thinking. She just stood there, holding the cup, looking at nothing in particular, while the morning light shifted across her face. Finally, she set the cup down. "How much for a bottle?" $15. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a 20. "Keep the change." She picked up a bottle, tucked it under her arm, and walked away without another word. Sarah stood there, watching her go, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. It was small, fragile, easily crushed, but it was there. A tiny spark in the darkness, a reminder that things could change, that the world could surprise you, that the right person could show up at the right moment and make everything seem possible again. By the end of the day, she had sold 12 bottles. Not enough to make a difference, not enough to pay for the repairs the mill needed, but enough to know that someone, somewhere, wanted what she was making. She drove home in the fading light, the truck rattling and shaking, the empty bottles clinking in the back, and she let herself imagine, just for a moment, that this might actually work. The next Saturday, she brought 8 gallons, and she brought her grandfather's ledger, because she had realized something important. The cider was good, better than good maybe, though it was too early to tell. But the story behind the cider was what would sell it, the history, the legacy. The fact that this was the same yeast her grandfather had used, the same trees, the same water from the same granite aquifer that had been filtering rain for 10,000 years. People wanted stories. She had learned that at the winery, watching tourists pay $50 for a bottle of wine that tasted like every other bottle of wine, simply because the marketing had told them it was special. She had hated that. The manipulation, the dishonesty, the way the wine industry had turned something sacred into something transactional. But this was different. This wasn't manipulation. This was truth. She wrote it all out on index cards in her careful, neat handwriting and taped them to the front of her table. "This cider is made from heirloom apples grown on land that has been in my family for 3 generations. The yeast was preserved by my grandfather in 1993 and has been dormant until this year. The water comes from a granite aquifer that filters it to 94% purity without any human intervention." And she put out more samples. Not just sips, full cups, small cups, but full enough that people could actually taste what she was offering. The response was different this time. People stopped. They read the cards, they asked questions, they tasted the cider and their eyes widened, and they asked for another sample just to be sure. They bought bottles, not just one, but 2, 3, 4 at a time. They took her cards, the ones with the phone number she had printed at the bottom, and they promised to call, to tell their friends, to come back next week with more people. She sold out by 11 a.m. And then, just as she was packing up, a woman approached her table. Young, maybe 30, with sharp eyes and expensive boots and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was holding a bottle of cider, one of Sarah's bottles, and turning it over in her hands like she was looking for flaws. "This is interesting," the woman said. "Where did you say these apples came from?" Sarah recognized her. Not by name, she had never learned the new girlfriend's name, had refused to give her that satisfaction. But she recognized her. The way she stood. The way she looked at things like she was calculating their value. The way she smiled without any warmth, like smiling was a tool rather than an expression. "My family's land," Sarah said. The woman nodded slowly. "I've heard about that land. My partner," she paused, letting the word hang in the air. "My partner says it's worthless, too remote, too rocky, too hard to farm." Your partner is wrong. The woman's smile tightened. Is he? He seems to be doing pretty well with the winery. You know, the one you built? Sarah felt the words like a physical blow. She had known this moment would come, had known that eventually her past would catch up with her, had known that she couldn't hide in the hills forever. But she hadn't expected it here, in this dying town, at this small market, in front of these people who had started to believe in her. She took a breath. Is there something I can help you with? The woman set the bottle down on the table, hard enough that it made a sound. I'm just curious about your process, the yeast you mentioned, the one your grandfather preserved. I'd love to know more about it. And I'd love to tell you, Sarah said, but I don't share trade secrets with competitors. The woman's eyes flashed. Competitors? Please, you're selling cider out of the back of a truck. We're selling wine to Michelin-starred restaurants. We're not competitors. Then why are you here? The question hung in the air between them, unanswered. The woman stared at Sarah for a long moment, her smile gone now, replaced by something colder, something that looked almost like fear. Then she turned and walked away, her boots clicking on the pavement, her expensive coat billowing behind her in the wind. Sarah watched her go, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not fear. She was too tired for fear. Not anger. She had spent too much anger already. Something else, something that felt almost like relief. The secret was out. The winery knew. And now, whatever happened next, she wouldn't have to spend every market day wondering when they would show up. She finished packing her truck in silence, loaded the last of the empty bottles into the back, and drove home with the windows down and the wind in her hair and the taste of wild apples still on her tongue. The next 2 weeks were the hardest of her life. Not because of the work was hard, but she was used to hard. Not because of the loneliness. She had been lonely for years, had learned to live with it, had started to think of it as just another sensation, like hunger or cold. It was because of what happened after the market. The word spread. Not far. Oak Springs was too small for word to spread far, but far enough. Far enough that people started showing up at the mill, driving up the rutted road in cars that bottomed out on the rocks, walking through the blackberries in shoes that weren't made for it, standing in the doorway and looking around at the collapsed roof and the rotten floor and the woman who lived in a truck and asking, "Is this where the cider comes from?" And Sarah had to tell them yes. Yes, this was the mill. Yes, it was falling apart. Yes, she slept in a truck because the building wasn't safe. Yes, she did everything by hand, with tools that were older than her father, with a press that had been built before electricity was common, with a yeast culture that had been sleeping for 3 decades and had woken up hungry. Some of them turned around and left, clearly disappointed, clearly expecting something different, something prettier, something that didn't look like failure. But some of them stayed. They asked questions. They offered help. They brought tools and supplies and food, because that was what people did in small towns, because the instinct to help was stronger than the instinct to judge, because they had seen enough failure in their own lives to recognize that it wasn't the same thing as worthlessness. A man named Joe showed up with a hammer and a saw and 2 days of free labor. He was retired, he said, and he was bored, and he had always wanted to learn how cider was made. Sarah put him to work fixing the door, and by the end of the first day, it was hanging straight for the first time in 30 years. A woman named Maria showed up with a pickup truck full of apple crates, the good kind, the wooden kind, the kind that had been sitting in her barn since her father died, and she couldn't bear to throw them away. She said she didn't want anything in return, but Sarah gave her a bottle of cider anyway, and Maria drank it sitting on the tailgate of her truck, looking out at the hills, and said, "My father would have loved this." And a young man named David showed up with a camera. He was a journalist, he said, or trying to be. He wrote for a small food blog that almost no one read, but he had heard about the cider from a friend of a friend, and he wanted to write a story. Was that okay? Could he take some pictures? Could he watch the pressing? Sarah said yes because she was learning to say yes, because saying no had never gotten her anywhere, because she had spent 25 years saying yes to the wrong person, and it was time to start saying yes to the right ones. David stayed for 3 days. He took pictures of everything, the press, the stones, the apple trees, Sarah's hands covered in juice and sawdust and the evidence of work. He asked questions that made her think, that made her remember things she had forgotten, that made her see the mill through new eyes. And when he left, he promised to send her the story before he published it. She didn't believe him. Journalists were busy and she was nobody, and the story of a woman rebuilding a cider mill in the middle of nowhere wasn't exactly breaking news. She thanked him, shook his hand, and watched his car disappear down the rutted road, and then she went back to work. The story appeared 6 days later. Not on the food blog, David had sent it there, but the editor had passed, saying it was too long, too niche, too focused on one person's story instead of the broader trends in artisanal fermentation. But David had sent it somewhere else, somewhere smaller. A regional magazine called the Sierra Foothills Quarterly, which had a circulation of maybe 5,000, and a readership that consisted mostly of people who had retired to the mountains and wanted to know what was happening in their new home. The editor loved it. She ran it as the cover story, with David's photograph spread across 6 pages, and within a week, Sarah's phone started ringing. Not much at first, a call here, a call there, people who had read the story and wanted to try the cider. People who had known her grandfather and wanted to share their memories. People who had been through their own divorces, their own losses, their own quiet apocalypses, and who recognized something in Sarah's story that made them want to reach out. But then the calls changed. Distributors. That was the word they used, distributors. People who bought products from small producers and sold them to stores, restaurants, bars. People who had read the story and tasted the cider. David had sent samples apparently because he was smarter than Sarah had given him credit for, and wanted to know if she could scale up. Could she produce more? How many gallons per week? Could she bottle it professionally? Did she have labels? A website? A business plan? She didn't have any of those things. She had a press that was held together with hope and determination, a roof that still leaked in 3 places, a truck that coughed and shuddered and smelled like mice, and a yeast culture that seemed to get stronger every day.